Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into something older than cities, older than writing, a time when humans still shared the world with monsters. The air was colder, the nights were longer, and survival wasn't a right. It was a daily negotiation with death. So before we vanish into that forgotten world, take a second to like the video if you're into this kind of ancient storytelling, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing who's out there, listening to stories this old. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a blanket or a background fire sound, and let's begin tonight's journey through deep time. This is primal instinct. You're starving. Not the kind of hunger you know. Not the mild discomfort of a missed meal or the rumble of an empty stomach before dinner. This is something deeper, something that reaches into your bones and pulls at the marrow. Your body is eating itself from the inside out, consuming muscle, dissolving fat that was never there to begin with. Your vision blurs at the edges. Your hands shake as you grip the stone in your palm. You're one of the last 17 members of your tribe, and you haven't eaten in 4 days. I watched this unfold 37,000 years ago, in what you would call Eastern Europe. The ice had come early that year, a killing frost that turned the grasslands white and sent the herds fleeing south. The berries had withered on their stems. The roots had frozen solid in the ground. And now, as the wind howled through the valley like the breath of some ancient beast, I watched these humans face the oldest enemy of all, starvation. They huddled together in a shallow cave, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The mother held her child against her chest, feeling the bird-quick flutter of his heartbeat through skin stretched thin over ribs. The hunter sat near the entrance, his eyes scanning the white expanse beyond, searching for movement that never came. The elder, her hair the color of ash and her fingers gnarled like winter branches, hummed an old song under her breath, a memory of abundance, of times when the world was green and giving. But I knew what they didn't. I had seen this before, countless times across countless winters. The human body, remarkable as it was, had limits. After 3 days without food, the liver depletes its glycogen stores. After a week, the body begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy. After 2 weeks, the immune system fails. After 3, the heart simply stops. They had perhaps 10 days left. Less for the children. The hunter rose, his movements slow and deliberate to conserve energy. He had been the strongest among them once. I remembered watching him bring down a young mammoth just 2 summers past, his spear finding the soft spot behind its ear as his brothers drove it toward the cliff. Now his arms were like branches, his chest hollow beneath the furs. "I go," he said, and the words came out as barely more than a whisper. The others didn't argue. They knew, as he knew, that staying meant certain death. Going meant almost certain death. But almost was better than certain. Always had been. Always would be. He took a spear, a thing of ash wood and napped flint, bound with sinew that had grown brittle in the cold. He took a pouch of snow to melt in his mouth as he walked. He took nothing else, because there was nothing else to take. I followed him as he left the cave, watched as he paused at the entrance to look back at his people, his mate, his son, his mother, perhaps for the last time. Then he turned and walked into the white silence of winter, and I went with him. The world had changed. Where once there had been vast grasslands teeming with bison and wild horses, now there was only snow and ice and the occasional dark smudge of exposed rock. The trees were skeletal things, their branches heavy with frost. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving only a crushing silence that pressed against the ears like deep water. The hunter walked for hours, his feet breaking through the crust of snow with each step. Ice formed in his beard. His fingers, wrapped in strips of hide, began to lose feeling. But he pressed on, following old paths that his people had walked for generations. Paths that led to hunting grounds, to water sources, to places where food had always been found. But the old rules no longer applied. The climate had shifted, as it did every few thousand years, and the world that had sustained his ancestors was gone. In its place was this, a frozen wasteland that cared nothing for the small, warm-blooded creatures trying to survive within it. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple, the hunter found something. Tracks, not the broad, round prints of mammoth or the cloven marks of reindeer, but something smaller. Rabbit, perhaps, or hare. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old, leading toward a cluster of boulders half buried in snow. Hope flickered in his chest like a small flame. He gripped his spear tighter, forced his numbed feet to move faster. If he could catch even a single rabbit, it would buy them another day, maybe two, and sometimes a day was all that separated the living from the dead. But as he rounded the boulders, spear raised and ready, he found not prey, but another predator. A wolf, gray as smoke and thin as death, crouched over the torn remains of the hare. Its yellow eyes met his, and for a moment, neither moved. I had seen this meeting played out 10,000 times across 10,000 years. Wolf and human, the two great survivors of the Ice Age, faced across a distance of 20 paces. Both starving, both desperate, both willing to do whatever it took to see another sunrise. The wolf's lips pulled back, revealing teeth like yellow daggers. A growl rumbled from its chest, low and threatening. The hunter raised a spear, though his arms shook with the effort. They stood there as the light faded. Two hunters reduced to scavengers, each waiting for the other to make the first move. And in that moment, I saw not the future lords of the earth, but two dying animals fighting over scraps in a world that was trying to kill them both. The hunter took a step forward. The wolf tensed. Another step. The growl deepened. On the third step, the wolf made its choice. It grabbed what remained of the hare in its jaws and fled, disappearing into the gathering darkness like smoke on the wind. The hunter fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow. There were scraps left. Bits of fur, fragments of bone, a few strips of meat too small for the wolf to bother with. He gathered them with shaking hands, stuffed them into his pouch. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. But it was something. As he turned to begin the long walk back to the cave, I saw him pause. There, in the snow beside the wolf's tracks, was something else. A plant, somehow still green despite the killing cold, pushing up through a crack in the rocks. The hunter fell upon it, tearing it from the ground, roots and all. He recognized it. Wild garlic, a thing his grandmother had shown him when he was young. It keeps the body strong, she had said, when all else fails. He ate it there in the darkness, dirt and all, feeling the sharp taste flood his mouth. Then he found another and another. Not enough to fill his belly, but enough to give him strength for the journey home. When he finally stumbled back into the cave, hours past midnight, his people were still alive, still waiting. He distributed what little he had found. The scraps of meat to the children, the garlic roots to the adults. They ate in silence, knowing it wasn't enough, knowing that tomorrow they would be hungrier still. But they were alive, and in that world, in that time, being alive for one more day was victory enough. I watched them settle back into their huddle, sharing warmth and what comfort they could find. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the hunter's tracks, erasing all sign of his desperate journey. And somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, a sound of hunger and loneliness and the fierce will to survive. They would make it through this winter, these 17 humans. Barely. They would lose 3 to the cold and hunger. The elder, whose songs would fall silent on a night when the stars were sharp as flint, a child whose name I still remember, and a young woman who would give her last portion of food to her sister and slip away in her sleep. But the others would survive. They would adapt. They would learn. And when spring finally came, bringing with it the return of the herds and the greening of the world, they would be ready. This was how it always was. In the time before agriculture, before storage, before surplus, every meal was a battle. Every day was a victory. And every human who drew breath did so in defiance of a world that offered 1,000 different ways to die. They didn't know it then, but they were learning the first and most important lesson of survival. When the world gives you nothing, you take whatever you can find. Plant or animal, fresh or rotting, familiar or strange. If it could be chewed and swallowed, it was food. This was the beginning of the human diet, not a menu chosen for pleasure or preference, but a desperate scramble for calories in a world where starvation was always just one failed hunt, one early frost, one missed opportunity away. And I was there to witness it all. The boy watched his father work, mesmerized by the ancient ritual unfolding before him. I had seen this scene countless times across countless generations, the passing of knowledge from parent to child, the careful instruction and skills that meant the difference between feast and famine. But this time, 28,000 years ago in what you would call southern France, I sensed something different, something that would change everything. The deer had been dead for 2 days. The hunting party had found it at the base of a cliff, its neck broken from a fall, the meat already claiming by wolves and carrion birds. In the world I watched over, such a find would have been ignored by most predators. The choice cuts were gone. What remained was considered worthless. But humans had learned to see value where others saw waste. The father knelt beside the carcass, his stone tools laid out beside him like a surgeon's instruments. Each had been carefully napped, shaped for a specific purpose through years of practice. The boy, perhaps 7 summers old, squatted nearby, his dark eyes following every movement. "Watch," the father said, and his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. "The others take only the easy meat, but we take everything." He began with the skull. Using a heavy stone, he struck precise blows along the cranium, creating fracture lines. The sound echoed across the valley. Crack, 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 rhythmic as a heartbeat. On the 4th blow, the skull split open, revealing the prize within. Brain, gray-pink and glistening, untouched by decay, protected by its fortress of bone. The father scooped it out with his fingers, divided it carefully, half for him, half for the boy. They ate it warm and raw, the fatty tissue sliding down their throats like the richest of delicacies. Because that's what it was. Pure fat and protein, dense with calories, packed with nutrients that their grain-free, sugar-free diet desperately needed. "The brain feeds the brain," the father said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Remember this." But they were far from finished. Next came the long bones, femur, tibia, humerus. These had been cracked open by the wolves, but not completely emptied. The father showed the boy how to use a hammerstone and anvil, placing the bone just so, striking at exactly the right angle. Crack. The bone split lengthwise, revealing the marrow within, a substance like butter, yellow-white and rich. They used thin sticks to extract it, sucking every last bit from the hollow chambers. Marrow was survival food, dense with calories, full of fat that their bodies craved. In a world without agriculture, without reliable plant foods for much of the year, animal fat wasn't a luxury. It was life itself. "See how the wolves left much behind?" the father asked, gesturing to the scattered bones. "They have strong jaws, but no tools. They cannot reach what we can reach." They worked systematically through the skeleton. The vertebrae were split for their spinal cord. The ribs were scraped clean of every shred of meat and cartilage. Even the hooves were cracked open for the small deposits of marrow within. And then the father did something I had rarely seen before. He gathered the clean bones, the ones fully stripped of marrow, and placed them in a hide bag he had brought. "Why keep these?" the boy asked. "There is nothing left." The father smiled, a rare expression in that harsh world. "You will see." They returned to their camp as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The tribe had made their home a shallow cave overlooking a river valley, a place where they could watch for both prey and predators. The fire was already burning, tended by the elder who never let it die. The father took the bones to a flat stone near the fire, then showed the boy how to crush them into fragments, then into powder. It was hard work, requiring patience and precision. The boy's arms ached, but he didn't complain. He had learned long ago that complaints filled no bellies. When they had a pile of bone meal, the father did something extraordinary. He took a hollow gourd that had been cleaned and dried, filled it with water from the river, and added the bone powder. Then, using wooden tongs, He took stones that had been heating in the fire and dropped them into the mixture. The water boiled instantly, hissing and bubbling. The bone powder dissolved, creating a thin, white broth. The smell that rose from it was subtle but unmistakable. The essence of the animal, concentrated and purified. "Bone tea," the father said, ladling some into a smaller gourd and handing it to the boy. "When there is no meat, when there is no marrow, there is still this." The boy drank, feeling the warmth spread through his chest and into his belly. It tasted of minerals and memory, of the deer's last run through the forest, of the calcium that had made its bones strong. It wasn't filling in the way that meat was filling, but it was something. In a world where something was always better than nothing, it was enough. Other members of the tribe gathered around, drawn by the smell. The fathers shared what they had made, teaching the technique to any who would learn. Some of the older hunters scoffed. They remembered times of plenty, when such desperate measures weren't necessary. But the mothers watched carefully, memorizing every step. They knew that knowledge like this could keep their children alive through the lean times. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, I watched the boy fall asleep with his belly warm from bone broth, his mind full of new knowledge. He didn't know it yet, but he had just learned one of the most important lessons of human survival. That innovation born of desperation could open new sources of nutrition, could find sustenance where none seemed to exist. This was how humans had survived when larger, stronger predators had perished, not through power, but through ingenuity, not through specialization, but through adaptation. They had learned to eat what others wouldn't, to extract nutrition from sources others couldn't access, to see food where others saw only waste. Over the coming years, I would watch this knowledge spread. The bone broth technique would be refined, improved. They would learn that adding certain plants could improve the flavor and increase the nutrition. They would discover that bones from different animals produced different results. Bird bones were hollow and cooked quickly. Mammoth bones required days of processing, but yielded enough calcium to supplement an entire tribe. But on this night, it was just a father and son, sharing knowledge by firelight. The boy would grow to be a great hunter, would teach his own children the secrets of survival. And always, he would remember that first taste of bone tea, that first lesson in seeing sustenance where others saw only death. This was the human advantage. Not their weak teeth or their fragile bodies, but their minds that could look at a scatter of old bones and see a meal. Their hands that could craft tools to access what nature had locked away. Their ability to transform the inedible into the edible through technology as simple as fire and stone. They were not the strongest predators in their world, but they were becoming the most resourceful. And in the harsh mathematics of survival, resourcefulness beat strength every time. The wolves howled in the distance that night, as they always did, but inside the cave, warmed by fire and filled with bone broth, the humans slept peacefully. They had found another way to stay alive in a world that offered no guarantees. And tomorrow, they would search for more. The woman's fingers bled as she dug, but she didn't stop. I watched her work in the weak light of early spring, 23,000 years ago, in what you would call Central Asia. The ground was still hard from winter's grip, reluctant to yield its treasures. But she knew they were there, hidden beneath the soil like secrets. Her grandmother had shown her, just as her grandmother's grandmother had shown her, in an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back to the beginning of memory. She was the gatherer, though that simple title barely captured the depth of her expertise. In her mind lived a map of every edible plant within a day's walk of their camp. She knew when each would emerge, where each preferred to grow, how to identify them before their leaves fully formed. She knew which roots grew fat with starch in spring and which turned poisonous by summer. She knew which seeds could be eaten raw and which required careful preparation to remove their toxins. Her knowledge was survival itself. The digging stick struck something firm, and her cracked lips curved into a smile. Carefully, she excavated around the obstruction, revealing a cluster of roots each the size of her fist. Wild yam. Not true yam as you would know it, but a hardy tuber that had sustained her people through countless hungry springs. She pulled them free, shook off the dirt, and added them to the hide bag at her waist. 3 other women worked nearby, each focused on their own tasks. The youngest, barely past her first blood, gathered the tender shoots of bracken fern, careful to take only the tightly coiled fiddleheads that were safe to eat. The elder collected mushrooms, her ancient eyes still sharp enough to distinguish the edible from the deadly. And the mother, her infant bound to her chest in a sling of soft deer hide, stripped bark from a birch tree. The inner bark, sweet with sap, that could be chewed for hours to keep hunger at bay. This was women's work, as vital as any hunt. While the men pursued large game that might or might not be caught, the women provided the steady, reliable calories that kept the tribe alive. On average, I had observed, the plants and small foods gathered by women provided 60 to 80% of the tribe's nutrition. The dramatic kills of mammoth and bison made for better stories around the fire, but it was the quiet, constant work of gathering that truly sustained human life. "Here," the gatherer called softly, gesturing to the others. She had found something special. A patch of wild onions, their green shoots just breaking through the earth. The women converged, careful not to take too much, knowing that overharvesting would mean no onions next year. They took half, left half, and carefully covered the remaining bulbs with soil. This too was knowledge. Not just what to take, but how much to leave. They were not farmers, not yet, but they understood the reciprocal relationship between human and plant. Take everything, and next year you starve. Take wisely, and the earth would continue to provide. As the sun climbed higher, warming the air and bringing out the scent of growing things, the women's bags grew heavy with their harvest. Roots and shoots, bark and bulbs, mushrooms and moss. To an untrained eye, it would look like random forest debris. But each item had been selected with purpose, identified with certainty, gathered with skill honed over generations. They paused at midday by a stream, sharing water from a hide flask and a handful of dried berries from the previous autumn. The infant fussed, and the mother put him to her breast, humming an old song while he nursed. The other women sorted their gatherings, discussing recipes and preparation methods. "The yam is good roasted," the elder said, her voice like wind through dry leaves, "but better boiled with the fat from marrow bones." "And the fiddleheads?" asked the youngest. "Quickly over hot coals. Too long and they become bitter. Too short and they will twist your stomach into knots." This was how knowledge passed, not through written words, for writing was still 20,000 years in the future, but through patient instruction, careful observation, and endless repetition. Every woman carried in her mind a vast encyclopedia of botanical knowledge, a library of survival written not in symbols, but in experience. As they prepared to return to camp, the gatherer noticed something that made her freeze. There, at the base of an oak tree, grew a cluster of plants she had never seen before. The leaves were the wrong shape for anything she knew, the stems an unusual purple color. Her first instinct was to avoid it. In the plant world, unfamiliar usually meant dangerous. But then she looked closer. The roots, visible where rain had washed away the soil, were thick and white. The leaves, while oddly shaped, showed no signs of the waxy coating that often indicated poison. And there, half hidden beneath the foliage, were seed pods that looked almost like those of the groundnut vine. She made a decision the humans had been making since the beginning. The decision to experiment. Carefully, she dug up a single plant, keeping it separate from the other food. Tonight, she would test it. A tiny piece first, touched to the lips. If no burning or numbness, then a small piece on the tongue. If that caused no reaction, a piece the size of a fingernail, chewed and spit out. Only after all these tests would she swallow the smallest amount and wait to see what her body told her. It was dangerous, this experimentation. I had watched countless humans die from a single mistake, their bodies racked with convulsions or slowly shutting down from organ failure. I had also watched them discover new food sources this way, expanding their diet one careful test at a time. The knowledge gained from each success, and each failure, would be passed down, added to the vast oral tradition that kept the tribe alive. The women returned to camp as the shadows grew long, their bags heavy with the day's harvest. The men had been unsuccessful in their hunt, returning empty-handed and frustrated. But there would be no hunger tonight. The yams went into the coals to roast. The fiddleheads were quickly seared and distributed to the children. The mushrooms were added to a stew made with the last of the winter's dried meat, and the gatherer began her careful test of the unknown plant, watched closely by the other women. By morning, if she showed no signs of illness, they would have added another food to their repertoire, another small victory against starvation. This was the other half of the human diet. Not the dramatic hunting of megafauna, but the patient, careful gathering of plants. It required different skills than hunting: deep botanical knowledge, keen observation, patience, and the wisdom to know when to experiment and when to stay safe. It was work that connected humans to the land in an intimate way, teaching them the rhythms of growth and decay, the subtle signs of seasonal change, the complex web of relationships between soil and seed and survival. The gatherer's fingers had healed by evening, the small cuts already scabbing over. Tomorrow they would crack open again as she dug for more roots, climbed for more bark, reached for more berries. It was hard work, constant work, work that left its marks on the body. Permanently bent fingers from years of digging, teeth worn down from grinding tough plant fibers, knees scarred from kneeling on rocky ground. But it was also work that kept her people alive. Every root dug, every shoot gathered, every seed collected was a small victory against hunger. And in a world where hunger was the constant enemy, those small victories added up to survival. As the fire burned low and the tribe settled for sleep, I watched the gatherer carefully wrap the unknown plant in soft leather, saving it for tomorrow's tests. Always learning, always adapting, always pushing the boundaries of what could be eaten. This was how humans had spread across the world, not just by following the herds, but by learning to eat whatever grew wherever they went. The knowledge lived in her hands and her memory, passed down through generations of women who had kept their people fed through ice ages and droughts, through times of plenty and times of desperate want. It was knowledge written not in books, but in the living library of human experience, each generation adding new chapters to the story of survival. And tomorrow, if the tests went well, she would add one more. The convulsions started at dawn. I watched the young hunter writhe on the ground, his muscles locked in spasm, his jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. His brothers held him down, confusion and fear written across their faces. They had seen illness before, had watched fever and infection claim their share of lives. But this was different. This was the salt hunger, though they had no name for it yet. It was 19,000 years ago, in the flat grasslands of what you would call Eastern Europe. The tribe had been following the reindeer herds for 3 moons, moving always north and east, away from their familiar territories. The hunting had been good, too good. They had gorged on fresh meat for weeks, their bellies full, their spirits high. But a diet of pure muscle meat, I knew, was a slow poison. The elder was the first to understand. She had lived through 6 dozen summers, had seen this sickness before in her youth. She barked orders to the women, who scattered across the camp, searching through their supplies. But they found nothing that would help. They were too far from the sea, too far from the salt licks where animals gathered, too far from the dried blood and organs they would normally consume. The hunger inside, the elder muttered, her gnarled hands hovering over the convulsing hunter. The body eats itself when salt runs dry. She was more right than she knew. Without sodium, the human body cannot maintain fluid balance. Muscles cramp, neurons misfire, the heart stutters. Death comes not from starvation, but from systemic collapse. The body's own electrical systems shorting out like lightning-struck trees. The hunter's mate knelt beside him, tears cutting channels through the dirt on her face. Their child, barely walking, clung to her side, too young to understand why father thrashed and moaned, but old enough to fear. The whole camp gathered around, helpless, watching one of the strongest being brought low by an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Then the clever one spoke. He was not the biggest hunter nor the strongest, but his mind moved in directions others didn't. He had been watching the reindeer they hunted, noticed how they would sometimes travel great distances to reach certain grounds where they would lick the earth itself. The deer know, he said. We must follow where they go to lick the ground. It was a desperate plan. The hunter might not survive a journey, but staying here meant certain death. If not for him, then for others, as the salt hunger spread through the tribe. They made their choice quickly, as humans always did when faced with death. They would move. They fashioned a drag litter from saplings and hide, cushioned with moss and fur. The convulsing hunter was strapped down, his body still rigid with spasms. For men would take turns dragging him. The rest would scout ahead, looking for signs. I followed their desperate march across the grasslands. The spring sun was weak but persistent, melting the last patches of snow and turning the ground to mud that sucked at their feet. They moved slowly, burdened by their sick and their fear. Other members of the tribe began showing symptoms: muscle twitches, crushing headaches, a terrible thirst that no amount of water could quench. On the second day, they found the first sign: tracks converging from multiple directions, all leading toward a low rise in the distance. Reindeer tracks, but also those of wild horses, aurochs, even the massive prints of a mammoth. The clever one ran ahead, his fatigue forgotten. He crested the rise and stopped, staring down at a sight that would save them all. A natural salt lick, where mineral-rich water had evaporated over millennia, leaving deposits of white crystal on the dark earth. Animals clustered around it. A temporary truce among species, all driven by the same biological need. The tribe approached carefully, not wanting to spook the animals into stampeding, but the beasts barely noticed them. So focused were they on licking the precious minerals from the ground. The humans joined them, falling to their knees, pressing their faces to the earth. The salt burned their tongues, bitter and metallic, but their bodies knew what they needed. They licked and scraped, gathering the crusty deposits in their hands. The elder mixed salt with water in a hollow gourd, creating a brine that she carefully spooned into the convulsing hunter's mouth. The effect wasn't immediate, but over the hours that followed, as they continued to dose him with salt water, his muscles began to relax. The convulsions eased to twitches, then stopped altogether. By evening, he was able to sit up, weak but lucid, his body's electrical systems restored to balance. They stayed at the salt lick for 7 days, letting their bodies replenish what had been lost. But more importantly, they learned. The clever one organized expeditions to gather the salt, scraping it from the earth and storing it in hide pouches. They watched which plants grew near the lick, noticed that their leaves had a salty taste. They learned that the organs of animals, especially the liver and kidneys, concentrated these vital minerals, and they learned the warning signs, the muscle cramps that came first, the confusion and irritability, the terrible thirst. They learned to recognize the salt hunger before it progressed to convulsions, learned to seek out natural licks or, when those couldn't be found, to prioritize eating organ meats and drinking blood. This knowledge would prove crucial as humans continued their relentless expansion across the globe. In coastal areas, they learned to evaporate seawater, creating their own salt supplies. Inland, they mapped the locations of every natural lick, treating them as sacred sites where enemies might meet in temporary peace. They learned that certain clay soils could provide minerals, that the ashes of certain plants were rich in potassium, that blood drunk fresh from a kill could stave off the hunger for weeks. But on this day, they simply celebrated survival. The hunter, still weak but improving, held his child while his mate prepared a meal of fresh meat seasoned with precious salt. The tribe shared their stories of other hungers, the bone hunger that made teeth fall out, though they didn't know to call it scurvy, the sun hunger that came in the depths of winter, vitamin D deficiency, the bleeding sickness that affected women who ate no organ meat, iron deficiency anemia. Each story was a lesson, a piece of the vast puzzle of human nutrition that they were solving through trial and error, through suffering and observation. They didn't understand the biochemistry, wouldn't for another 19,000 years, but they understood the practical reality. The human body needed more than just meat and plants. It needed minerals, salts, trace elements that could mean the difference between strength and weakness, between clarity and madness, between life and death. As night fell over the salt lick, I watched them carefully wrap their gathered salt in waterproof bladders, treating it with the same reverence they showed for fire-making tools or healing herbs. Some will be saved for emergencies. Some will be traded with other tribes, becoming one of humanity's first trade goods. And some would be used to preserve meat, extending its edibility and allowing for longer journeys between kills. The young hunter slept peacefully that night, his body finally at ease. His mate lay beside him, one hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. Their child slept between them, safe and unaware of how close they had come to losing their father. The salt hunger had been defeated, but it would return. It always did. Whenever humans pushed into new territories, whenever they relied too heavily on a single food source, whenever they forgot the hard-won lessons of balance and variety. But each time it returned, they would be a little more prepared, their knowledge a little deeper, their survival a little more assured. This was how humans learned to eat, not through careful planning or scientific understanding, but through crisis and adaptation. Every mineral deficiency taught them to seek new foods. Every poisoning taught them what to avoid. Every survival added to the accumulated wisdom that would eventually allow them to inhabit every corner of the earth, adapting their diets to deserts and tundra, to islands and mountains, to any place where life was possible. The salt lick would be remembered. Its location would be passed down through generations, added to the mental maps that every human carried. And the story of the hunter's convulsions would be told around fires for years to come, a reminder that the body's needs were complex and that survival required more than just filling the belly. It required understanding, observation, and the wisdom to learn from every hunger. The smell hit them from 100 paces away. Sweet, cloying, unmistakable. Death, old death, the kind that made other predators turn away in disgust. But the humans moved toward it, drawn by necessity and knowledge that transcended revulsion. I watched them approach through the morning mist, 15,000 years ago in what you would call northern Spain, their faces set with grim determination. The mammoth had been dead for perhaps 7 days. The great tusked giant lay on its side in a shallow ravine, its massive body bloated with gases, its hide rippling with the movement of things beneath. Vultures scattered at the humans' approach, their bald heads slick with gore. Wolves had been here too, and bears, each taking what they could before the meat turned too foul even for them. But humans had learned what others hadn't, that death was not a single event but a process, and each stage of that process offered different opportunities for those desperate enough to seize them. The leader of this small band was a woman whose hair had gone white before its time, marked by years of survival against odds that would have killed most. She studied the carcass with the calculating eye of an expert, noting the state of decay, the pattern of scavenger damage, the way gases had bloated the belly, but not yet split it open. "Still good," she announced, and the others trusted her judgment. They had to. In their world, passing up potential food could mean starvation, but eating the wrong kind of decay could bring death even faster. The writhing gut death, the fever death, the foaming mouth death. They worked with practiced efficiency. First, the hide. Even after a week, mammoth skin was valuable beyond measure. They peeled it back carefully, revealing the seething mass beneath. The smell intensified, making the youngest hunter gag and turn away. But the elder woman cuffed him sharply on the shoulder. "Breathe through your mouth," she commanded. "The nose lies. The eyes tell truth." And what the eyes saw was opportunity. Yes, the surface meat was green-black with rot, writhing with fly larvae. But beneath that outer layer, protected by the mammoth's thick hide and massive muscle walls, lay meat that was merely aged, not truly spoiled. The humans had learned to recognize the difference. The sweet sick smell of surface decay versus the deeper, more dangerous odor of meat gone truly bad. They cut away the outer layers, discarding them for the carrion birds. Beneath, the meat was dark and soft, partially broken down by its own enzymes, but not yet claimed by the bacteria that would make it toxic. This was the window, perhaps 2 or 3 days, when partially decayed meat was actually easier to digest than fresh, the proteins already partially broken down, the tough connective tissues softened. But the real treasures lay deeper still. The leader directed them to the belly cavity. Using stone knives and careful leverage, they split open the bloated abdomen. The gases that escaped made even the hardened adult step back. But what they revealed was worth the assault on their senses. The organs, protected by the body cavity, preserved by their own chemical composition, many remained edible far longer than muscle meat. The liver, though darkened, was still firm. The kidneys, wrapped in their protective fat, were barely touched by decay. And the heart, that dense muscle that even predators often left behind, was perfectly preserved, marinated in its own blood. They worked quickly now, aware that opening the body cavity had started a new clock. Exposed to air, even these protected organs would spoil rapidly. They carved out what they could carry, wrapping each piece in fresh leaves to keep the different stages of decay from contaminating each other. But the elder woman wasn't finished. She directed the strongest hunters to crack open the skull. No easy task, even with the bones somewhat softened by decay. It took a dozen blows with heavy stones before the cranium split, revealing its contents. The brain was partially liquefied, yes, but not rotten. The high-fat content had preserved it, turned it into something almost like cheese. Pungent, certainly, but rich with the fatty acids that human brains desperately needed to function. They scooped it out with curved pieces of bark, dividing it among the children first. Brain for brain, as the old saying went. Then came the marrow extraction. In fresh kills, marrow was a delicacy that required careful cracking of bones. But in aged carcasses, the bone itself had begun to soften. They could access marrow that would have been impossible to reach otherwise, sucking it from bones that bent rather than broke, extracting every calorie from the massive skeleton. As they worked, the elder woman taught. This was how knowledge passed, not in abstract lessons, but in the doing, in the smell and taste and careful observation of decay's progress. See how the meat near the bone stays good longest, she said, peeling back a section of rib meat that was still pink beneath its darkened surface. The bone protects, keeps the deep rot away. And here, she pointed to where the mammoth's thick fur had created a pocket of different decay. Where air couldn't reach, the meat ferments instead of rots. Sour but safe, like berries left too long in the sun. The youngest hunter, still green at the gills but learning, asked the crucial question. How do you know? How do you tell good decay from bad? The elder woman considered this, her hands still working even as she taught. The smell changes. Good decay smells like earth, like leaves in autumn. Bad decay smells like the shit pits in high summer. The color matters too. Purple-red can be eaten, green-black cannot. And the texture. She pressed a piece of meat between her fingers. If it springs back, it remembers being alive. If it smears like mud, it has forgotten, and will make you forget too. This was knowledge earned through generations of careful experimentation, through countless stomach aches and food poisonings, through watching who lived and who died after eating from carcasses at different stages of decay. It was unpleasant knowledge, even repulsive, but it was the knowledge that had allowed humans to survive in environments where fresh kills were rare and competition for them fierce. They filled their carrying bags with their gruesome harvest, each piece carefully selected, each representing calories that would keep them alive for another day. The liver alone, even partially decayed, contained enough vitamin A to prevent night blindness for weeks. The fermenting stomach contents, disgusting as they appeared, were rich with partially digested plant matter and beneficial bacteria that would aid their own digestion. As they prepared to leave, the elder woman did something that surprised even her experienced companions. She gathered some of the fly larvae, white, writhing things that made everyone's stomach turn, and wrapped them in a separate pouch. Protein is protein, she said simply, and these little ones have been eating what we cannot. They turn poison into food, decay into life. In the hardest times, we must be willing to eat as they do. It was a lesson in humility as much as survival. Humans might use tools and fire, might have language and culture, but in the end, they were part of the same cycle of consumption and decay as every other creature. The only difference was their willingness to learn from that cycle, to find sustenance in places others feared to look. The journey back to camp was subdued, each person processing what they had seen and learned. The meat they carried was not the triumphant prize of a successful hunt, but the grim necessity of survival in a world that offered no guarantees. It would be cooked thoroughly, mixed with herbs that aided digestion and masked the stronger flavors, distributed according to need rather than preference. Some would struggle to eat it, their bodies rebelling against what their minds knew was necessary. Others would consume it gratefully, understanding that squeamishness was a luxury they couldn't afford. And all would remember this lesson, that survival sometimes meant embracing the very edge of decay, dancing on the line between nourishment and poison, taking what others left behind and transforming it into another day of life. That night, as they prepared their harvest over carefully tended fires, I watched them perform the ancient alchemy of survival. They mixed the aged organ meats with bitter herbs that would help neutralize any toxins. They cooked everything longer than fresh meat required, using heat to complete the breakdown that decay had started. They ate slowly, carefully, their bodies alert to any sign of rejection. And they survived, as they always had, as they always would, by pushing the boundaries of what could be eaten, by refusing to let pride or disgust stand between them and another sunrise. The mammoth, even in its decay, had given them life, and in that gift, however unpleasant its form, lay the secret of human persistence in a world that favored no one. The vultures returned to the carcass the next day, finding it much diminished. They squawked their displeasure at these strange predators, who competed even for the spoils of rot. But the humans were already gone, carrying their grim feast back to hungry mouths, adding another chapter to the endless book of survival. And I followed, as I always did, watching them transform death into life, decay into sustenance, disgust into determination. This too was part of the human story. Not just a noble hunt or the patient gathering, but the willingness to descend into death itself and emerge with whatever could be salvaged. In a world where starvation was always just one missed opportunity away, even the rotting corpse of a mammoth was a banquet for those who knew how to read the signs of decay. The child burned with fever, her small body trembling despite the furs piled upon her. I had watched this scene too many times to count. A young one caught in the grip of illness, hovering between this world and the next. But this time, 13,000 years ago, in what you would call the forests of Central Europe, I would witness something remarkable. Not the tragedy of loss, but the triumph of accumulated knowledge, passed down through countless generations of careful observation and desperate experimentation. The healer knelt beside the child, her weathered hands moving with practiced certainty. She was old by the standards of her time, perhaps 45 summers, and in her mind lived the collected wisdom of every healer who had come before her. Not written wisdom, for writing was still thousands of years in the future, but wisdom encoded in songs, in stories, in the careful preparation of remedies that could mean the difference between life and death. Around her neck hung a pouch made from the bladder of a deer, and from it she drew her tools: dried leaves, powdered bark, roots wrapped in soft leather, seeds that rattled like tiny bones. To modern eyes, it might have looked like the collection of a forest floor, random debris gathered by superstition. But each item had been selected through generations of trial and error, each one a lesson learned through survival or loss. The fever had come suddenly, as fevers often did. One day the child was running with the others, the next she was collapsed by the stream, her skin hot enough to cook meat. The hunters had carried her back to camp, where her mother now sat, keening softly, rocking back and forth in the ancient rhythm of grief anticipated. But the healer had seen this fever before, had seen it claim some and spare others, and most importantly, had learned from her own teacher which plants could tip the balance toward survival. She began with willow bark, scraping the soft inner layer into a wooden bowl. This was old knowledge, ancient even by their standards. Every child learned early that the willow tree held the fever breaker in its skin, though none could have explained why. They didn't need to understand salicin or its conversion to salicylic acid in the body. They only needed to know that it worked. The healer chewed the bark herself first, her own saliva beginning the breakdown process, then spat the pulp into water warmed by hot stones. The resulting tea was bitter enough to make the eyes water, but bitterness, they had learned, often meant medicine. The sweet plants might fill the belly, but the bitter ones could save a life. Getting the child to drink was another matter. Her jaw was clenched, her throat swollen. The healer called for help, and together with the mother, they carefully pried open the small mouth, spooning in the liquid drop by precious drop. Most ran down the child's chin, but some made it past the swollen throat. It would have to be enough. Next came the cooling. The healer directed the others to bring water from the coldest part of the stream, where it ran fast over stones. She soaked moss in this water and placed it on the child's forehead, neck, and wrists, all the places where the blood ran close to the skin. The fever fought back, burning through the moisture almost as fast as they could apply it, but they persisted. As night fell, the healer prepared her more potent medicines. From her pouch came a root that smelled of earth and thunder, what distant descendants would call echinacea, though she knew it only as the purple cone flower's hidden strength. She had learned its use from her own teacher, who had learned it from hers, in a chain stretching back to the first human who had noticed that wounded animals would seek out and chew these roots. She prepared it carefully, knowing that too much could poison, too little would be useless. The margin between medicine and toxin was narrow, measured not in milligrams, but in experience, in the careful observation of pupils dilating, breathing changing, the subtle shifts that told a skilled healer when to stop. The child's father returned from a desperate hunt, carrying not meat, but something more valuable, a handful of fungus scraped from a birch tree. The healer's eyes lit up. This was powerful medicine, saved for only the most serious illnesses. The fungus, what would one day be known as chaga, was ground into powder and mixed with fat to make a paste. She smeared it on the child's chest, where the heat of fever would release its properties through the skin. Through the night, the battle continued. The fever raged, trying to burn out whatever infection had taken hold. The healer fought back with every tool her ancestors had discovered. Willow for the fever, echinacea for the infection, chaga for its mysterious ability to strengthen the body's own defenses. She sang the old songs, not from superstition, but because the rhythm helped her time the doses, helped her remember the exact sequences that had saved lives before. The child's breathing grew labor toward morning, and the healer made a desperate decision. From the very bottom of her pouch, wrapped in the softest deer hide, came her most dangerous medicine. A single dried mushroom, red with white spots. The destroyer angel's cousin, fly agaric. In large doses, it brought visions and death. In tiny amounts, carefully prepared, it could break a fever when nothing else would. She scraped off a piece smaller than a fingernail, dissolved it in water with herbs that would moderate its effects. The other adults drew back, recognizing the mushroom, knowing the risk. But the child was dying, and desperate times called for desperate measures. One drop, then two, then waiting, watching for the signs. The slight dilation of pupils, the change in breathing that would tell her when to stop. The healer's hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of responsibility. Too much, and she would be the child killer, forever marked. Too little, and the fever would win anyway. The child convulsed once, twice. Then her breathing deepened. The terrible heat began, finally, to break. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Not the dry burn of fever, but the honest moisture of a body, remembering how to regulate itself. The healer sagged with relief, knowing she had walked the knife's edge successfully once more. By the time the sun rose fully, the child's fever had broken. She would live, though recovery would be slow. The healer packed away her medicines, each one returning to its specific place in her pouch. Tomorrow or next season or next year, she would need them again. And someday, when her own hands grew too trembled to measure the dangerous doses, she would pass this knowledge on to another. This was medicine before medicine, healing before science understood what healing meant. It was imperfect, often dangerous, sometimes fatal, but it was also remarkably sophisticated, built on thousands of years of careful observation. These healers knew that willow bark eased pain and fever. They knew that certain molds could fight infection. They knew that foxglove could steady an irregular heartbeat, though too much would stop it forever. They had discovered, through terrible trial and error, many of the same compounds that modern medicine would later synthesize and standardize. They had learned that the margin between medicine and poison was often razor thin, that the same plant that could save a life could also end it. That dosage and preparation were everything. The child slept now, peaceful for the first time in days. Her mother wept with relief, touching the healer's hands in wordless gratitude. The men brought the best portions of their hunt to the healer's fire, payment for services that couldn't truly be valued in meat or hide. But the real payment was the survival of knowledge itself. Each success added to the accumulated wisdom. Each failure taught its own harsh lessons. And slowly, painstakingly, over generations beyond counting, humans had assembled a pharmacopoeia from the forest floor, turning the chemistry of plants into the chemistry of survival. They ate to live, yes, but they had also learned to eat to heal, to eat to prevent illness, to eat in ways that went beyond simple nutrition. The bitter medicines were food of a different kind. Food for the body's defenses, food for its ability to repair and restore itself. The healer rested by the fire, exhausted but satisfied. Tomorrow there would be other illnesses, other challenges. But today, knowledge had triumphed over death. The old ways had proven their worth once more. And somewhere in the forest, the plants grew on, offering their chemical secrets to any who had the wisdom to understand them. This too was part of humanity's long education in eating. Learning not just what would fill the belly, but what would heal the body, strengthen the spirit, and carry the tribe through another season of survival. In the end, medicine and food were not separate categories, but part of the same desperate, creative, endless experiment in staying alive. The storm had been brutal. 3 days of wind that screamed like dying beasts and waves tall as cliffs. But now, as dawn broke over what you would call the coast of Portugal 11,000 years ago, the sea had given up its violence and offered gifts instead. I watched the tribe emerge from their shelter among the rocks, blinking in the sudden calm, and make their way down to the beach that had been transformed by the storm's fury. The seeker led them, a woman whose knowledge of tides and shores had kept her people fed through the lean months when the inland hunting failed. She read the beach like others read animal tracks, knowing where the storm would have deposited its treasures, where the rocks would trap the fleeing creatures of the deep. And what treasures there were. The storm had torn kelp forests from their holdfast, casting them up in great tangled mountains along the high tide line. Already, sand fleas and small crabs worked through the mass, but the humans would claim their share. The kelp itself was food, salty, chewy, rich with minerals that their inland diet could never provide. But more importantly, tangled in those brown ribbons were other prizes, mussels still clinging to the stalks, small fish trapped and dying in the air, sea urchins bristling with defensive spines that would not save them now. The children ran ahead, squealing with delight as they discovered tide pools transformed into natural traps. Fish that normally lived in deeper water had been caught by the retreating storm's surge, imprisoned in these temporary aquariums. The boys and girls grabbed with quick hands, tossing their catches onto the sand before the fish could dart into hiding beneath the rocks. But the seeker's eyes were on a different prize. There, where the waves still pulled at the sand with dying energy, dark shapes littered the beach. Shellfish, thousands of them, torn from their beds by the storm's fury. Clams, their shells still tightly closed, protecting the meat within. Oysters, rough and ugly on the outside but hiding treasure. And scattered among them, the greatest prizes of all, abalone, their mother-of-pearl shells glinting in the morning sun. The tribe fell upon this bounty with practiced efficiency. This was not their first storm harvest, nor would it be their last. They knew the sea's gifts came with timer. What wasn't collected quickly would be reclaimed by the next high tide or spoil in the sun. The women and children gathered the kelp, separating the tender tips from the tougher stalks. Some would be eaten fresh, its salty crunch a welcome change from the monotony of meat and roots. But most would be dried, laid out on the rocks to desiccate in the sun. Dried kelp could last for months, could be ground into powder and added to stews, could provide the salts and minerals that inland plants never could. The men worked on opening the shellfish, a task that required both strength and skill. Oysters had to be pried open with stone blades, their sharp shells capable of slicing fingers to the bone. Clams were easier if you knew the trick. Quick insert of a thin blade between the shells, a twist, and they opened like flowers. The meat inside was gray-pink and glistening, tasting of the sea itself. They ate as they worked, the freshest seafood imaginable. Raw oysters sliding down throats, their briny essence the concentrated taste of the ocean. Clam meat sweet and tender, nothing like the tough, dried meat they were used to. The children learned to suck sea urchins from their spiny shells, their faces puckering at the intense flavor that was somehow both revolting and addictive. But the seeker knew that seafood's greatest gift wasn't its taste, but its nutrition. She had seen what happened to inland tribes that never tasted the sea. The swollen necks, the bulging eyes, the children born wrong. The seafoods prevented these ailments, though she couldn't have known she was preventing iodine deficiency. That the seafood was rich with omega fatty acids that built healthy brains. That the shellfish contained zinc and selenium and a dozen other trace elements that human bodies craved. As the sun climbed higher, they made another discovery. The storm had scoured away sand from a section of beach, revealing a bed of ancient shells. Not fresh ones, but old deposits where countless generations of shellfish had lived and died. The shells had broken down into sharp fragments, but among them were treasures. Perfect shells that could be used as tools, cutting implements sharper than many stones. And there was something else. The seeker's grandson, a boy of perhaps 10 summers, came running with something clutched in his fist. A pearl. Small and imperfect, but unmistakably a pearl. It would become decoration, yes, but also currency. Coastal tribes had learned that inland peoples would trade much for these small treasures of the sea. The work continued through the day. Some of the men ventured into the still rough surf, feeling with their feet for the buried clams that the storm hadn't dislodged. They knew to watch for the small jets of water that betrayed a clam's presence, knew to dig quickly before it could burrow deeper. Others worked the rock pools, using sticks to extract octopuses from their crevices, avoiding the beak that could deliver a nasty bite. The women made salt. In pools above the high tide line, seawater had been trapped and concentrated by days of sun. They carefully scraped the white crystals that formed at the edges, collecting this precious mineral that their bodies needed and that could preserve meat for the journey inland. This too was knowledge hard won. The difference between sea salt and the bitter minerals that could poison, the best conditions for evaporation, the proper storage to keep the salt dry. As afternoon wore on, they prepared for preservation. A fire was built from driftwood, burning hot and fast with the strange blue-green flames that salt-soaked would produce. Fish were gutted and splayed on wooden racks to smoke. Shellfish meat was threaded on cord made from twisted kelp fibers. Some of the kelp was buried in sand pits with hot coals, a slow-cooking method that would break down its tough fibers and concentrate its flavors. But perhaps the most important discovery came near sunset. The storm had killed a seal, washing its body into a rocky cove. Seals were not often taken. They were too quick in the water, too wary on land. But this gift from the storm was precious beyond measure. The meat was rich and fatty, different from land animals. The blubber was rendered down into oil that would burn in lamps through the dark months, providing light and heat. The skin would make the finest of garments, naturally waterproof and warm. Every part was used. The bones, lighter than land mammal bones, made excellent fishing hooks and needles. The whiskers became thread for the finest sewing. Even the contents of its stomach were examined. Partially digested fish that told them what species were running in the deeper waters, knowledge that would guide future fishing efforts. As darkness fell, the tribe made camp above the high tide line, exhausted but exhilarated. They had gathered more food in one day than a week of inland hunting might provide. But more than that, they had renewed their connection to the sea, to its rhythms and gifts and dangers. The children fell asleep with bellies full of seafood, their bodies absorbing nutrients that would build strong bones and sharp minds. The adults sat around the fire, planning. Some of this bounty would be taken inland, traded with tribes that had never tasted the sea. Some would be cached here, buried in cool sand and marked with stones, emergency supplies for lean times. And some of the tribe would stay. The young adults, newly paired, would make their homes here on the coast. They would learn the tides and seasons, the migrations of fish, and the breeding times of shellfish. They would become sea people, different from their inland cousins, shaped by the rhythm of waves rather than the movement of herds. This was how humans had conquered the coasts, not through any grand plan, but through opportunism and observation. They had learned that the sea, terrible and dangerous as it could be, was also generous beyond measure. It offered foods no land could provide, medicines in its seaweeds, tools in its shells, wealth in its pearls. The storm had been a destroyer, yes, but had also been a teacher and a provider. It had reminded them that catastrophe and opportunity were often the same thing, seen from different angles. The sea took lives, but it also gave them. And for those wise enough to read its moods and brave enough to accept its gifts, it offered a path to survival that the land alone could never match. As I watched them sleep on the beach, bellies full and faces turned toward the stars, I knew this was a turning point. These humans were no longer purely land creatures. They had tasted the sea's bounty and found it good. Their descendants would build boats, devise nets, learn to read currents and stars. They would become navigators and traders, carrying the sea's gifts to every corner of the world. But tonight, they were simply survivors who had learned one more way to stay alive. The ocean had fed them, and they would remember, in their songs and stories, in the knowledge passed from parent to child. The sea would always be both monster and mother, danger and provider, the great unknown that could kill or sustain with equal indifference. The waves continued their eternal conversation with the shore, and the humans slept on, dreaming perhaps of pearls and storms, of shells and salt, of all the treasures that waited beneath the waters for those brave enough to seek them. The old woman's eyes went wide as the taste hit her tongue. Sweetness, pure and shocking, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. I watched her face transform with wonder, then immediately narrow with the suspicion of someone who had survived 60 winters by trusting nothing that seemed too good. She was right to be cautious. The honey she had just tasted was worth more than the lives of the 3 men who had died getting it. It was 9,000 years ago, in the forests of what you would call Thailand, and the war between humans and bees was about to claim more casualties. The climber stood at the base of the massive tree, studying the angry cloud of insects that surrounded their fortress 30 meters above. He was young, perhaps 17 summers, but already bore the scars of previous raids. Welded arms, a permanently swollen eyelid from a sting that had nearly killed him. But he was also the best climber the tribe had, and honey meant survival, not just because of its sweetness, though in a world without sugar. That alone made it precious beyond measure. Honey was medicine. It never spoiled, could treat wounds, could give a dying child the energy to fight through illness. It was currency. Tribes would trade a season's worth of furs for a single gourd of honey, and it was sacred. The only food that seemed to come from another world, too perfect for the harsh reality of daily survival. The tree was a giant, its trunk so wide that 6 men holding hands couldn't encircle it. The bees had chosen well, building their hive in a hollow near the crown, protected by smooth bark and dizzying height. Previous attempts to raid had failed. The evidence still lay at the tree's base. A shattered skull, half buried in leaves, from a climber who had fallen 2 seasons ago. But the tribe was desperate. The children were developing the lethargy that came from a diet of nothing but meat and bitter roots. The pregnant women craved sweetness with an intensity that drove them to chew tree sap until their teeth hurt. And the old woman, the keeper of memories, had been telling stories of the last successful honey raid. 5 years passed, when the tribe had feasted for days on the golden treasure. The climber had a plan. He had watched the hive for a full moon cycle, noting when the bees were most active, when they retreated inside. He had discovered that smoke made them sluggish, though too much would drive them to attack in suicidal fury. Most importantly, he had noticed that the bees were less aggressive during the dark of the moon, when the night was blackest. Tonight was such a night. He prepared carefully. His body was coated with mud mixed with certain crushed leaves that the bees seemed to dislike. He wore only a loincloth. Excess clothing would give the bees more places to become entangled and sting. His climbing rope, woven from bark fibers, had been tested and retested. At his waist hung a specially prepared gourd, its inside coated with beeswax to hold the honey, its opening just wide enough for his hand. The firekeeper had prepared the smoke bundles, dried fungus wrapped in green leaves that would smolder without flaming. These would be hauled up after him, providing the crucial smoke screen for the final assault on the hive. As darkness fell complete, the climber began his ascent. The tribe watched from a safe distance, their fires banked low to avoid attracting the bees. Every handhold had to be found by touch, every foothold tested before trusting it with his weight. The bark was rough on his hands, leaving them bloody before he was halfway up. At 20 meters, he could hear them, the deep, thrumming hum of thousands of bees at rest. The sound seemed to come from the tree itself, as if the giant had a heartbeat. He paused, letting his racing heart slow, knowing that fierce sweat would attract the guards. He continued climbing, each movement deliberate and silent. At 25 meters, he felt the first scout land on his shoulder. He remained perfectly still as it walked across his skin, its tiny feet like whispers of death. After an eternity, it flew away, satisfied that this strange mud creature was not a threat. Finally, he reached the level of the hive. Even in the darkness, he could see its outline, a mass of comb hanging from the hollow, glowing faintly with its own strange light. The smell of honey was overwhelming, making his mouth water and his stomach clench with hunger. He signaled down with the rope, and slowly, carefully, the smoke bundles were hauled up. This was the most dangerous moment. If the bees sensed threat now, he would be dead before he could descend 3 meters. He lit the bundles from the coal he carried in a hollow horn, blowing gently to encourage the smoke. It rose in thick clouds, enveloping the hive. The humming changed pitch, became confused, agitated but not yet angry. He had to work fast. Reaching into the hollow, his hand encountered the warm, living mass of bees covering their treasure. They crawled over his fingers, confused by the smoke, but their stingers remained sheathed. He pushed deeper until his hand found what it sought, the heavy, dripping combs of honey. He broke off a section, feeling the honey run over his hands, and quickly stuffed it into his gourd. Then another and another. The bees were beginning to recover from the smoke, their confusion turning to anger. He felt the first sting on his wrist, then another on his neck. Time to go. But as he turned to descend, his foot slipped on honey-slick bark. For a heart-stopping moment, he hung by one hand, 30 meters of empty air below him. The movement disturbed the hive fully, and now the bees came in force. Not dozens, but hundreds, pouring from the hollow in a living cloud of rage. He found his foothold and began descending faster than was safe, feeling stings on his back, his legs, his face. His eyes were swelling shut, making it impossible to see the handholds. He climbed by memory and instinct, the angry cloud following him down. 10 meters from the ground, his strength gave out. The accumulated venom was making his muscles seize, his vision blur. He fell the rest of the way, crashing through branches, landing hard enough to drive all breath from his body. The tribe rushed forward, smoking torches in hand to drive off the bees. They dragged the climber to safety, his body already swelling from dozens of stings. The medicine woman worked frantically, applying poultices of chewed herbs, forcing him to drink the bitter tea that might counteract the venom. But even as they fought to save his life, they celebrated. The gourd had survived the fall, still containing several combs of honey. The children were given the first taste, their faces lighting up with the same wonder the old woman had shown. The pregnant women received their shares, their bodies craving the quick energy the honey provided, and they saved some for the climber, if he survived the night. He did survive, though it was close. For 3 days, he burned with fever, his body fighting off the massive dose of venom. But on the fourth day, he woke clear-eyed and hungry. They fed him honey mixed with water, the ancient recovery drink that could bring someone back from the edge of death. As he recovered, he told them what he had learned. The hive was even larger than they had thought. Enough honey to last the tribe for months, if they could get it all. But it would take a different approach. Maybe smoking the bees out entirely. Maybe waiting for winter, when they were more sluggish. This was how humans learned to steal from bees. Through pain, through loss, through desperate courage. Over generations, they would refine their techniques. They would learn to follow honey-guide birds to hidden hives. They would discover that leaving some comb ensured the bees would rebuild, providing future harvests. Some tribes would even learn to keep bees, building hollow logs for them to inhabit, the first steps toward true agriculture. But on this night, they simply celebrated survival and sweetness. The honey was portioned out carefully. Medicine for the sick, energy for the pregnant and nursing, a tiny taste for each child to remember. It would have to last until the next raid, the next climber willing to risk everything for the golden treasure. The climber bore his scars proudly. Each welt was a mark of courage, each swollen sting a badge of honor. He had faced death and returned with sweetness, had stolen from the gods of the air and lived to tell the tale. In the stories that would be told around fires for generations, he would become legendary. The boy who climbed to the sky and brought back the sun's own food. But I had seen this story before, would see it again. The war between humans and bees was as old as both species, a dance of theft and retaliation, of desperate need and fierce protection. Honey was the first luxury food, the first taste that went beyond mere survival to touch something deeper in the human spirit. The craving for pleasure, for sweetness, for something in life beyond the endless struggle to not die. It was a craving that would drive humans to extraordinary risks, would lead them to domesticate bees and later sugarcane and sugar beets, would eventually fill their diets with more sweetness than their bodies could handle. But that was still far in the future. Tonight, there was only wild honey, stolen at terrible cost, shared among the tribe like liquid gold. The old woman took her small portion and let it dissolve slowly on her tongue, making it last. She remembered the last honey raid, and the one before that, each separated by years of waiting and wanting. This sweetness had cost blood and nearly a life. But as the taste filled her mouth, as the energy flowed into her tired bones, she knew it was worth it. Sweetness was life intensified, concentrated into a single sensation that made all the bitter roots and tough meat worthwhile. It was proof that the world held treasures worth any risk, worth any pain. It was the beginning of humanity's long, complicated relationship with sugar. A relationship that would eventually reshape the world, drive empires, and fundamentally alter the human diet. But tonight, it was simply honey. Dangerous, precious, perfect honey, warming bellies and lifting spirits in a dark forest where sweetness was the rarest magic of all. The smell hit them first. Sharp, yeasty, wrong but somehow not unpleasant. The foraging party had been following the river for 3 days, searching for the grove of nut trees they remembered from seasons past. What they found instead would change everything. I watched them approach the fallen log with curiosity and caution. 7,000 years ago, in what you would call the Caucasus Mountains. Inside the hollow trunk, rainwater had mixed with wild grapes that had fallen during the last harvest moon. Time and warmth and the invisible work of yeast had transformed this accident into something entirely new. The liquid was murky, bubbling slightly, and when the boldest of them dipped a finger to taste, his eyes widened with surprise. Like fruit, he said, but different, stronger, strange. The others gathered around, each taking a small taste. Some spat it out immediately, their faces twisted with disgust. But others paused, considering. There was something about this spoiled fruit water that wasn't entirely unpleasant. It tingled on the tongue, left a warm feeling in the throat, made the head feel slightly light. The wise woman, old enough to remember many strange discoveries, made a decision that would echo through history. "We take it back," she declared. "Study it, learned. They filled their water gourds with the strange liquid, noting how the grapes at the bottom were soft and broken, how the smell changed when disturbed. The journey back to camp was marked by occasional sips, each person trying to understand what they had found. By the time they reached home, those who had drunk the most were feeling its full effects. The young hunter who had been limping from an old injury was walking without pain, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny. The usually stern elder was singing songs from her childhood, tears streaming down her face, and the quiet craftsman was telling stories with wild hand gestures. His normal shyness dissolved like morning mist. The tribe gathered to witness this transformation. Some were alarmed. Was it poison? A curse? But the wise woman, who had drunk sparingly, observed with the careful eye of someone who had seen many mysteries revealed. The affected ones weren't dying. They were different, released. Their pain lessened, their sorrows temporarily lifted, their tongues loosened. As the effects wore off and the drinkers fell into deep sleep, the tribe discussed what they had witnessed. This liquid had power, not to nourish, but to alter, to change the mind, ease the body, shift the spirit. In a world where every day brought pain and struggle, anything that could provide even temporary relief was precious beyond measure. The wise woman organized experiments. They tried to recreate the accident, placing grapes in hollow gourds with water, waiting to see what would happen. Most attempts failed. The grapes simply rotted, creating foul-smelling mush. But sometimes, seemingly at random, the transformation would occur again. The liquid would bubble and change, developing the distinctive sharp smell and mind-altering power. Through trial and error, they began to understand the conditions needed. Crushed grapes worked better than whole ones. Warmth helped, but too much heat killed the magic. The containers needed to breathe, but not too much. And time. It always took time, days or weeks of patient waiting while the invisible spirits did their work. They learned other things too. That the liquid was safer than stagnant water, seemed to resist the spoilage that made people sick. That it could clean wounds better than plain water. That it made bitter medicines easier to swallow. That it could preserve fruit flavors through the winter months when fresh food was just a memory. But most importantly, they learned about its social power. When the hunters returned unsuccessful and dejected, a small portion of the fermented drink could lift their spirits. When the tribe gathered to discuss serious matters, sharing the liquid seemed to make tongues looser, ideas flow more freely. During ceremonies for the dead, it helped the grieving release their tears and share their memories. It also revealed dangers. The young warrior who drank too much became violent, starting fights over imagined insults. The mother who sought too often to ease her sorrows began neglecting her children. Some individuals seemed unable to stop once they started, drinking until they vomited or passed out. The wise woman established rules. The drink was to be controlled, rationed, reserved for specific times and purposes. Over the following seasons, knowledge spread. Other tribes learned the secret, each adding their own discoveries. Some found that different fruits created different drinks. Berries, wild apples, even tree saps could be transformed. Others discovered that grain soaked in water could undergo a similar change, creating a cloudy, potent brew that filled the belly, while it lightened the head. I watched as fermentation became integrated into human culture. What had begun as an accident became an art. Specialists emerged, usually women, who understood the subtle signs of good fermentation versus bad, who could taste a batch and know whether it would bring joy or sickness. These brew mothers became powerful figures, keepers of recipes and techniques that were closely guarded secrets. The fermented drinks became currency, used in trade between tribes. They became sacred, incorporated into religious ceremonies as a way to commune with spirits. They became medicine, mixed with herbs to create tinctures more potent than either component alone. They became social lubricant, easing the tensions that arose when different groups met to trade or negotiate. But perhaps most significantly, fermentation taught humans something profound about the world. There were invisible forces at work, transforming one substance into another through processes that couldn't be seen or fully understood. It was humanity's first glimpse into the microbial world, even if they interpreted it through the lens of spirits and magic. The knowledge of fermentation would eventually lead to bread, to cheese, to 100 other foods that required the partnership between humans and microorganisms. It would make water safe to drink in times when wells were contaminated. It would allow nutrients to be preserved and transported. It would become so integral to human culture that almost every society would develop its own fermented beverages, its own rituals around their consumption. But on this night, 7,000 years ago, it was still new magic. The tribe sat around their fire, passing a gourd of the precious liquid, each taking a small sip. They felt the warmth spread through their bodies, felt their aches ease, and their worries lighten. They laughed a little louder, sang a little longer, forgot for a moment the constant struggle of survival. The wise woman watched it all, already seeing the shape of things to come. This discovery would bring joy and sorrow in equal measure. It would heal and harm, unite and divide, create and destroy. Like fire, it was a tool that could warm or burn, depending on how it was used. But tonight, it was simply a gift. An accident transformed into intention. Spoilage transformed into sustenance. Ordinary grapes transformed into something that could, for a brief moment, transform the harsh reality of prehistoric life into something bearable, even beautiful. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged by human discovery. But below, around a small fire in the vast darkness, humans had found a new way to alter their consciousness, ease their pain, and briefly touch something beyond the grinding daily necessity of survival. They had discovered fermentation, and with it, a power that would shape cultures, topple kingdoms, and follow humanity through every age to come. The gourd passed hand to hand, each person taking their measured share. And in that sharing, in that communal altered state, they found something else. A deepening of bonds, a strengthening of tribe, a moment of collective transcendence in a world that usually demanded only individual survival. This too was food, though it fed something other than the body. It fed the human need for escape, for celebration, for something beyond the merely necessary. And like all powerful foods, it would prove to be both blessing and curse, medicine and poison, depending entirely on the wisdom of those who used it. The fire had been burning for 2 days, a massive pyre of hardwood that had slowly collapsed into a bed of glowing coals as wide as a man is tall. Now, as the sun touched the horizon on what you would call the autumn equinox, 6,000 years ago in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, 5 tribes gathered for something unprecedented. Not war, not weary trade, but a shared feast. The first intentional gathering where food would be not just consumed, but celebrated. I had watched these tribes for generations, seen them eye each other across rivers, occasionally clash over hunting grounds, more often simply avoid each other in the vast landscape. But something had changed. Perhaps it was the particularly abundant harvest season, perhaps the shared thread of the lion pride that had been taking hunters, or perhaps simply the accumulation of seasons where cautious trade had built threads of trust. The idea had come from the river people's matriarch, a woman whose hair had gone white but whose eyes still sparked with dangerous intelligence. She had sent runners to the other tribes with an unprecedented message. Bring your best food, your special preparations, your secret ingredients. Come together under the hunter's moon. Share what you know. Learn what others know. Feast as one people, if only for one night. It was a risk. Showing your food preparation secrets was like revealing your defensive positions. It exposed vulnerabilities, admitted dependencies, but it also offered the chance to learn, to taste, to discover new ways of survival. The river people had prepared the centerpiece, a whole aurochs, the wild cattle that stood taller than a man at the shoulder. They had hunted it 3 days ago, aged the meat in cool river sand, and now it roasted over the coals, turned constantly on green with spits. The smell carried for miles, rich with the herbs they had rubbed into the hide, the smoke from aromatic woods they had added to the fire. The mountain tribe arrived first, suspicious but curious. They brought gifts that spoke of their high territory. Pine nuts gathered at risk from dizzying heights, mushrooms that grew only in certain shadowed valleys, and their specialty, ibex meat dried with juniper berries and wild thyme until it was hard as wood but exploded with flavor when chewed. Next came the forest people, masters of the shadowed paths. Their baskets contained treasures of the deep woods, hazelnuts ground into paste and mixed with honey, berry wines fermented in hollow trees, and most precious of all, truffles they had trained their dogs to find. The smell of the fungi was intoxicating, earthy and profound. The grass runners appeared as the sun touched the horizon, having traveled the furthest. Nomads who followed the herds, they brought the preserved foods that allowed their mobility. Pemmican made from bison fat, dried berries, and meat pounded together into dense cakes that could sustain a hunter for days. They also carried bags of seeds they had learned to harvest from wild grasses, which they demonstrated roasting on flat stones until they popped like tiny thunder. Last came the lake dwellers, their approach announced by the smell of smoked fish. They bore baskets of dried water plants, strings of freshwater clams, and clay jars sealed with beeswax that contained their greatest secret, fermented fish sauce that could transform the blandest meal into something transcendent. As darkness fell, the 5 tribes arranged themselves around the great fire, still maintaining careful distances, but close enough to pass food hand to hand. The aurochs was ready, its skin crackling, fat dripping into the coals with hisses and flares. The river people's best butcher carved it with obsidian blades sharper than any metal, portions distributed equally among all gathered. But this was more than just sharing meat. Each tribe had prepared stations where they demonstrated their techniques. The mountain tribe showed how they used heated stones to cook stews and hide bags, the water never quite boiling, but hot enough to tenderize the toughest meat. The forest people revealed their method of wrapping fish in wet leaves with mushrooms and herbs, then burying the packages in coals. The children, less bound by the cautions of their elders, mingled freely. They darted between the cooking stations, eyes wide with wonder at foods they had never imagined. A mountain child tasted fermented mare's milk for the first time, her face cycling through disgust to surprise to delight. A river boy tried the forest people's acorn cakes, sweetened with dried berries and drizzled with honey. As the night deepened, the formal barriers began to break down. The elders found themselves comparing notes on preservation techniques. The lake dwellers' method of smoking fish interested the mountain tribe, who had similar needs for preserving meat through long winters. The grass runners' seed-gathering techniques fascinated the river people, who had begun noticing how certain grasses grew thicker near their permanent camps. Languages mingled and merged. Where words failed, gestures and tastes communicated. A grandmother from the forest people showed young women from other tribes how to test mushrooms for poison. The careful progression of lip, tongue, mouth, waiting between each stage. The river people's herbalists shared knowledge of plants that could ease birthing pains, cure stomach ailments, or bring down fever. The feast reached its peak when each tribe presented their masterwork. The mountain people produced a haunch of bear meat they had marinated in fermented fruit mash for a full moon cycle, the meat so tender it fell apart at a touch. The forest dwellers unveiled a log they had inoculated with mushroom spores, now fruiting with delicate oyster mushrooms that tasted like the essence of rain and earth. The grass runners demonstrated their portable feast, how a hunter could carry seeds, dried meat, and rendered fat that, when mixed with hot water, created a meal that was both filling and energizing. The lake dwellers brought forth fish that had been buried in salt and herbs for a full season, transformed into something almost cheese-like, pungent but addictive. The river people saved their surprise for last. They had discovered by accident that if grain got wet and began to sprout, then was dried and ground, it produced a sweeter flour. They had made flat breads from this modified grain, cooking them on hot stones. When broken and shared, the bread was unlike anything the others had tasted. Sweet, nutty, with a complexity that spoke of transformation. As the night wore on, more than recipes were shared. The tribes began to see patterns in their knowledge. The forest people's understanding of mushroom cultivation connected to the river people's observations about grain. The mountain tribe's food storage techniques could be adapted, to preserve the lake dwellers' fish through trade routes. The grass runners' mobility strategies could help others follow seasonal food sources without abandoning permanent camps entirely. They were witnessing, without fully understanding it, the birth of agriculture, not in the sudden invention of farming, but in the slow accumulation of observations about how plants and animals could be encouraged, guided, eventually controlled. Each tribe had pieces of the puzzle. Together, they began to see the whole picture. The children had fallen asleep in mixed piles, no longer caring which tribe they belonged to. The adults sat in smaller groups now, voices low but animated, sketching in the dirt, demonstrating techniques with their hands. Alliances were forming that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with food. As dawn approached, the fire had burned low, but the connections forged around it still glowed strong. Gifts were exchanged, not just food but knowledge. Seeds from the grass runners, mushroom-inoculated logs from the forest people, fermentation starters from the lake dwellers, dried herbs from the mountain tribe, sprouted grain from the river people. They made plans to meet again at the spring moon. Not all 5 tribes. That was too ambitious. But smaller gatherings, 2 or 3 groups at a time, continuing to share and learn. Trade routes were established not just for goods, but for knowledge. Young people would be exchanged to learn other tribes' techniques, creating bonds that went deeper than alliance. This feast marked a turning point. For the first time, humans had gathered not because they were starving and desperate, but because they had surplus and curiosity. They had come together to celebrate food, rather than merely consume it. They had shared not just sustenance, but culture, technique, innovation. As the tribes prepared to leave, the river people's matriarch spoke words that would echo through generations. Apart, we survive. Together, we thrive. The tribes dispersed as the sun rose, but they carried with them more than full bellies and new techniques. They carried the radical idea that cooperation could achieve what competition could not, that sharing knowledge multiplied rather than diminished it, that food was not just fuel for the body, but a bridge between peoples. I watched them go, these 5 tribes who had taken the first steps toward cuisine, toward agriculture, toward civilization itself. They didn't know they were making history. They thought they were just sharing a meal. But in that sharing, in that first great feast, they had discovered something profound. That humans were meant to eat together, and in eating together, they became more than the sum of their parts. The site of the feast would be remembered. In years to come, it would become a regular gathering place, then a permanent settlement, then perhaps a town where all 5 tribes' descendants would live and trade and intermarry. But that was still far in the future. For now, there were just footprints in the ash, scattered bones gnawed clean, and the lingering smell of smoke and roasted meat. Evidence of the night when humanity discovered that food shared was more than food doubled. It was civilization beginning. They ate the dogs first. I remember watching the decision being made. 1,000 years ago in what you would call Siberia, the winter had come early and fierce, trapping the band of 37 souls in their shelter before they could complete their food stores. Now, 3 months into the darkness, they faced the arithmetic of starvation. The leader, a woman whose face bore the scars of 40 winters, made the calculation with cold precision. The dogs consumed food. The dogs were food. In the brutal mathematics of survival, sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. But it wasn't just sentiment they were sacrificing. The dogs were hunters, guards, companions who had warned them of predators and helped track game. Eating them meant surviving the immediate crisis, but weakening their chances come spring. Such was the way of desperate choices. Every solution created new problems. They killed the oldest dog first, the one whose joints had stiffened, who could no longer keep pace with the sled. The children cried, but they ate. In the long winter, tears were common, but hunger was master. The meat was tough, stringy, tasting of the loyalty that had been betrayed. But it was meat, and in their situation, that was all that mattered. After the dogs came the leather. Every piece of hide clothing, every strip of binding, every leather tool handle was evaluated for its edibility. They had learned from previous winters that leather, being dried animal skin, could be processed back into food. It required long boiling, longer chewing, and provided little nutrition, but it filled the belly and quieted the pain for a while. The process was laborious. The leather was scraped of any remaining fur, cut into small pieces, and boiled for hours. The resulting broth was thin and bitter, more the memory of meat than meat itself. The leather pieces themselves could be chewed like the toughest of roots, providing the jaw work that somehow made hunger more bearable. They ate their clothes, essentially. Boots became soup. Belts became breakfast. The leather door covering that had kept out the wind was slowly consumed, replaced with packed snow that let in the cold, but couldn't be eaten. They wrapped themselves in furs that were too precious as insulation to be turned into food. Yet, then came the bone grease phase. Every bone from every animal they had killed since autumn was gathered. Bones that had already been cracked for marrow were crushed further, ground between stones until they were powder and fragments. This powder was boiled endlessly, the fat slowly rendering out, creating a grayish scum on the surface that was carefully skimmed and saved. The children were taught to suck on bone fragments for hours, extracting every possible molecule of nutrition. Their small teeth, still growing, were better suited to the task than adult teeth worn down by years of hard use. They became experts at finding the last hidden pockets of marrow, the final traces of cartilage, clinging to joint ends. The elder, too old to chew leather or crack bones, was fed the bone broth exclusively. She grew thinner by the day, her body consuming itself, but her mind remained sharp. She told stories to distract the children from their hunger, sang the old songs that helped people remember better times, and quietly made her own calculations about how much longer she was willing to be a burden. As the 4th month dragged on, they entered the dangerous phase. The truly desperate foods, the inner bark of trees, harvested at terrible cost as the men ventured into the killing cold. Pine needles boiled into a tea that provided some vitamin C, but caused stomach cramps. Lichen scraped from rocks, which required careful preparation to leach out the acids that could poison as easily as nourish. And then came the whispers about the last resort. It started with looks, glances at the weakest members of the group, unspoken calculations. The 2 men who had sickened from eating improperly prepared lichen were dying anyway. When they stopped breathing, would the taboo hold? The children were growing weaker. The pregnant woman had already lost her baby, her body unable to support 2 lives. How many would die to preserve the prohibition against eating human flesh? The leaders saw the thoughts forming, the terrible logic of survival beginning to override millennia of taboo. She had seen it before, in another winter, in another place. She knew that once that line was crossed, the band would never recover. Not physically. Human meat was just meat, but spiritually, socially, the trust that held them together would shatter. So she made a different choice. In the depths of the 5th month, when it seemed certain they would all perish, she announced a final hunt. Not for game. There was none. But for hope. 5 of the strongest would venture out, traveling light and fast, seeking any sign of early spring, any break in the weather that might allow access to cached supplies or frozen carcasses. It was almost certainly a death sentence for those who went, but it was action instead of passive waiting, hope instead of despair, and crucially, it prevented the group from turning on itself. The hunting party left on a morning so cold the breath froze before it left their mouths. Those who remained behind rationed the last of the bone grease, the final leather scraps, the remaining pine needle tea. They told stories of spring, of green things growing, of rivers running with fish. They held tight to their humanity, even as their bodies failed. 3 days later, the impossible happened. The weather broke. Not spring. That was still months away. But a warm wind from the south that lasted just long enough. It revealed a frozen creek where, miraculously, fish were trapped in the ice. The hunting party, who had found shelter and were preparing to die, discovered the fish and managed to return with the news. The entire band mobilized. Even the weakest crawled onto the ice, chipping with stones and broken bones to free the fish. They were small, barely worth the effort individually, but there were dozens of them, hundreds, enough. They ate them raw at first, too desperate to wait for fire. The fresh meat, the fat, the organs. It was like rain in the desert. Bodies that had begun shutting down sparked back to life. The pregnant woman felt her surviving baby move for the first time in weeks. The elder smiled and accepted a fisheye, the choicest part, knowing she would see another spring. They survived that winter, though they bore its marks forever. Fingers and toes lost to frostbite, teeth cracked from chewing bones and leather, metabolisms permanently altered by prolonged starvation. But they survived with their humanity intact, without crossing the final line. The dogs were gone. Much of their material culture had been literally consumed. They were weakened, scarred, forever changed. But when spring finally came, they were still a people, still a band, still bound by the trust and taboos that separated human from animal. This was the price of survival at the margins. Not just the foods they were forced to eat. The leather, the lichens, the bone powder, the desperation itself made manifest in their diet, but the choices they made about what not to eat. The lines they held even when crossing them might have meant a few more calories, a few more days. They had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes survival meant more than just staying alive. Sometimes it meant staying human. And in the long, dark winters at the edge of the world, that was the hardest battle of all. When the spring sun finally warmed the land and the first green shoots appeared, they fell upon them like treasures. Simple grass became a feast. The first rabbit of the season was cause for celebration. They had been reduced to eating the very materials of their culture, their tools, their clothes, their companions. But they had endured, and in the stories they would tell their children and grandchildren, they would speak not just of the hunger and the cold and the terrible things they ate. They would speak of the choices made, the lines held, the humanity preserved even in the face of death. For in the end, what separated them from the beasts was not just their tools, or their fire, or their language. It was their ability to choose death over dishonor, to maintain meaning even in meaninglessness, to remain a people even when reduced to the most basic animal needs. The long winter had taken much from them, but it had also taught them the true boundaries of human endurance and the price of remaining human when everything conspired to make them less. I am still here, after all the winters and summers, after all the hunts and harvests, after all the desperate experiments and careful observations. I remain, the fire that remembers, the witness to humanity's long education in staying alive. I have watched you transform from scattered bands of desperate foragers into the masters of the planet. Watched you learn that bone marrow could sustain life, that fermentation could preserve it, that salt could enhance it. Watched you discover that some hungers were for minerals, others for vitamins you couldn't name, still others for the simple comfort of sweetness in a bitter world. You learned to eat everything, the bitter roots that required processing, the toxic plants that could be made safe with knowledge, the rotting meat that was dangerous, but not deadly if you knew the signs, the insects, the grubs, things that crawled and squirmed and challenged your definition of food. You learned because you had to, because the alternative was death. But more than that, you learned to share knowledge. The woman who discovered which mushrooms were safe didn't keep that secret. The man who learned to smoke meat taught others. The child who noticed that sprouted grains tasted sweeter grew up to spread that observation. Knowledge became your greatest tool, more valuable than any spear or fire. You learned the rhythms of the world. When the salmon would run, when the berries would ripen, when the herds would migrate. You mapped not just the land, but the calendar of eating, the great cycles of abundance and scarcity that shaped your movements and your lives. You became students of the Earth's patterns, reading signs in the flight of birds and the growth of plants. You discovered that food was medicine, that willow bark eased pain, that certain molds fought infection, that fermented foods aided digestion. Your healers were also your nutritionists, understanding that what went into the body shaped its ability to heal and thrive. Every meal was pharmacy and fuel combined. You learned the social power of food, that sharing a meal created bonds stronger than blood, that feasting together could turn enemies into allies, that the act of providing food was an act of love, of care, of community building. The feast became ceremony. The hunt became ritual. The harvest became celebration. And you learned limits. That you could push your bodies to extraordinary extremes, eating leather and lichen and the very clothes off your backs. But that some lines should not be crossed. That survival meant more than just breathing another day. That remaining human sometimes meant choosing death over dishonor. Through it all, I watched. I saw the first person brave enough to eat an oyster, the first child to discover that ants tasted of lemon, the first grandmother to realize that cooking changed not just taste, but digestibility. I witnessed every triumph and tragedy, every feast and famine, every brilliant innovation and fatal mistake. Now you live in a world of abundance your ancestors couldn't imagine. Foods from every corner of the earth available at any moment. Calories so plentiful that excess has become a greater threat than scarcity. The desperate knowledge of which leather tastes best boiled replaced by debates over flavors and cuisines. But the old knowledge lives on. In your bones, in your genes, in the deep programming that makes you crave salt and sweet and fat, in the way your body still hoards calories against a famine that never comes, in the comfort you find in sharing meals, in the rituals of cooking and eating that bind you to each other and to your past. You are the children of survivors. Every one of your ancestors, without exception, found enough to eat to reach reproductive age. They ate the bitter and the sweet, the fresh and the rotting, the familiar and the terrifying. They experimented, adapted, learned, and passed that learning on. You carry their triumphs in your DNA, their knowledge in your cultures, their hunger in your cells. The fire still burns, different now. Gas and electric instead of wood and dung. But the principle remains. Humans gathering around warmth, preparing food, sharing sustenance and stories. The eternal cycle of hunger and satisfaction, of need and fulfillment, of survival and community. I have shown you these glimpses of your past, not to romanticize the suffering of your ancestors, but to honor their ingenuity. They faced a world that offered no mercy, no guarantees, no safety nets. They survived through intelligence, cooperation, and in willingness to try anything, eat anything, learn anything that might buy another day of life. They gifted you a world where hunger is a choice rather than a constant companion, where the question is not can this be eaten, but what should I eat? Where food is culture and pleasure and identity, not just desperate fuel for desperate days. Remember them, these ancient survivors. Remember the climber who faced 1,000 stings for a taste of honey. Remember the gatherer who knew every plant in her territory. Remember the hunter who shared his last portion with the children. Remember the healer who walked the knife's edge between medicine and poison. They live on in you. In every meal you share, every new food you try, every moment you choose cooperation over competition. In your farmers' markets and your family dinners, your holiday feasts and your simple Tuesday lunches. In the very fact that you can read this, well-fed and secure, never knowing the true desperation that drove humanity to eat its way to dominance. You are what you eat, but more than that, you are what your ancestors ate, what they learned to eat, what they taught each other to eat, what they refused to eat even when starving. The long education is over. The desperate experiments have been run. The knowledge has been won, preserved, passed down through 1,000 generations. You know what can be eaten. The question now is what should be eaten, how it should be shared. What kind of world you want to build with the abundance your ancestors could never have imagined. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls and the fire burns low, remember them. The hungry ones, the desperate ones, the clever ones who looked at a world full of poisons and possibilities and figured out, bite by careful bite, how to survive it all. They are the fire that remembers. And through them, through their hunger and their courage, you became the humans who feast. This has been their story. This has been your story. This has been primal instinct. For 50,000 years, they endured. Fire in their hands, shadows at their heels, and somehow they survived. This has been primal instinct. Until next time, stay alive out there.